Well, thanks so much for having me again. It is my fourth time. The first time I think I was invited by Oxford, but then they didn't want to see me again. So now it's been Oxford Brookes for the last 3 times. So I seem to have found a home, and I enjoy speaking each time. Now, this time, Charles said, well, what's the title of your talk? And I had to think a bit. And I had organized a seminar with a professional cycling team that I work with in Norway that does a lot of world tour races, but they're one step below that. And we brought together the coaches, and a lot of the time we spent trying to find our common language. And one of the speakers that I brought in was a sports psychology person who talked about this, shared mental models. So this is not physiology language for me. It's uncomfortable, but it seems to be pretty important that we have some common language, some common way of seeing different problems. And so I thought this was a useful way of thinking about what we're trying to talk about. What do we agree on in endurance training? And maybe the middle point is the best summary. Is mental models are working models of the world that humans create, that we try to achieve an understanding. And at least in Norway with the Olympic Federation there, we seem to have had some success in endurance sports by agreeing on some common language around intensity zones, around some methodologies that's allowed the skiers to speak to the rowers and the cyclists and so forth. So my talk today will not be about any given specific sport. It'll be trying to look at those kind of universalities that we have seen over the years. And so one of them, I want to talk a little bit about, what are the trainable components? That's kind of a common understanding of that. I want to talk a bit about prioritization of how we pursue and how we organize the training process. And I want to talk a bit about intensity zones as tools to balance signal and stress. Maybe a little bit different way of thinking about what we're really trying to achieve with intensity zones. I want to talk about triangulation. In this case, we'll talk about training monitoring. It helps us to know where we are, not only in GPS, but also in other ways. And then we'll try to look at this issue of what are the universals within endurance training, the things that apply to across sports, what are the sport-specific issues, some of them, and then can we move towards individual optimization? So that's the plan. And then we might ask, well, Steve, is that one mental model or is that 5 mental models? And in my mental model of the Oxford crowd, my thought is, well, on one side, we have the Brookes people saying, hello, that is not important, move along. And then we have the other side, they're saying, hang on, this could be something interesting to talk about, but we are going to move on because I'm going to be very Oxford Brookish right now. And so we'll start with trainable endurance. What are the components? Let's just do a quick review. And then we'll try to think about, is there a timeline in terms of how these responses or how these adaptations occur? And we can go back to a Cambridge fellow, sorry, Oxford, A.V. Hill, already 100 years ago, painted a similar picture for the pace duration curve or the power duration curve. This is a modern version of it from cycling, to pro cyclists. But we see this basic curve, it's very reproducible, and it's a function of the duration of maximum effort. And we can basically categorize human sports endeavors into these 3 categories from a kind of a metabolic point of view, with this middle zone that we often call middle distance being a tricky interaction between different energy systems. But already from about 4 minutes, we can say that essentially the athletes who are exceptionally good at a 4-minute event, like a 1,500 meter running race, can also be exceptionally good at a 10,000 meter running race or a 5,000 meter, or even a half marathon. So we see much more similarity than we see difference in the training methodology once the duration exceeds about 4 minutes. But 4 minutes versus 2, big difference. So that's some interesting issues around middle distance. So, and it all comes down to ATP. This is that molecule that our bodies can use. It's the only one that can be split, the phosphate removed, the chemical energy can then be used by muscle fibers for contraction and all kinds of other cellular processes. So we have these energy, so-called energy systems. We have this really short-term little battery of available ATP and creatine phosphate, lasts a few seconds. It's got to be recharged almost immediately. We have this so-called glycolytic phosphorylation, or some call it anaerobic glycolysis. That's an unfortunate term because it suggests that this is some separate oxygen-independent pathway, but it's really it's interconnected. And then we have what really matters, what's critical for us, both as just to live, but also in sports, is the oxidative pathway, where we pull oxygen in from the environment, we move it through the lungs via hemoglobin in the heart out to every cell. And then we have to return and get rid of the CO2. So we've got this nice balancing process going on between what we take for the environment and what we send back. Now, we have our model for endurance that's been built up over at least 100 years, but particularly the last, say, 5-6 decades, where we can say, well, VO2 max is a critical component. You need a high VO2 max if you're going to be an exceptional endurance athlete. That's a given, but it's not enough. You need to also be able to use a high percentage of that VO2 max for an extended period of time. And then the discussion often falls around, well, how long is extended? Is it 20 minutes, 30 minutes? Is it an hour? Is it 2 hours? And the answer is, yeah, it's in that range. Depends on how you define things. It's in the, I'll say 30 minutes to 2 hours as a rough approximation. But you need to have a high percentage of the VO2 max that's sustainable. And that gives you something we call performance VO2. What's the VO2 I can maintain for a 10K race or a half marathon or so and so forth. And then we need to connect it to the chassis or the bike or so forth and say, well, yeah, but what for that given metabolic power that you can bring to task, how fast can you go? What's your efficiency or your economy? And then we put that together, and then we have performance pace or power. So that's a basic model. And then we throw in a bit of anaerobic capacity. And I should say that this model is built up around steady state, like a marathon. This is how we've tested, but many endurance events, it would be more appropriate to think of it in terms of that there's a lot of intermittent interplay between very high intensity periods and lower intensity periods, and the aerobic capacity is constantly recharging the anaerobic. And so this is not a binary system. It's a highly integrated system. And it's also fair to say that we've often talked about these different abilities, these different capacities, as if we train them separately. Now I'm going to do VO2 max training. Now I'm going to do threshold training to improve my threshold. None of the evidence supports that. When we really look at training adaptation, we see a tremendous amount of overlap. We see that athletes that have trained for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, just low intensity, their VO2 max goes up, for example. It's overlapping, and that makes some sense in the sense that the system seems to be, the term has been used, symorphosis, meaning that there is a kind of a integrated adaptation process where the adaptations in the heart and the adaptations at the peripheral level, they are consistent with each other. You almost never see in practice an athlete with an exceptionally high VO2 max that has a really poor threshold. It doesn't happen. Why? Because if they're doing enough training to build the one, the other is also improving. So we need to keep that in mind. And training is not so polarized in the sense that it only improves VO2 max, but it doesn't improve peripheral adaptation. That's just not the way the evidence points. Now, we look at VO2 max, we know it's a function of this much we know. You can't have a higher VO2, you can't use O2 if it's not delivered. So there is an upper end, and it's determined by the ability to deliver oxygen via blood flow via the heart. And we have this, we know quite a bit about this cascade moving oxygen from the air all the way to the mitochondria. When it comes to fractional utilization, it is a term that has many names. As I've said, I want to say it's in this ability to maintain a high percentage of VO2 max in a semi kind of a quasi steady state for a fairly long, fairly high number of minutes, like 30 to 120 minutes. But again, there's so much argumentation about how we define threshold. I think we should be satisfied with understanding it conceptually and then being consistent around how we define it specifically when making our comparisons. Now, I love this from Hoffman and Schockert, this basic, I use a 3-zone model. Almost every physiologist who publishes on endurance will use a 3-zone model because there are physiological anchor points that we can identify. And what I like about this model is they provided us a kind of a basic idea of what's going on with lactate in that first zone, in the second zone, in the third zone. And in that first zone, lactate is being produced. Lactate is produced when there's plenty of oxygen available, just so we're clear. But in that first intensity zone, the lactate that is produced by muscle is almost immediately then either converted to pyruvate, moved into mitochondria, or it might slip out and move to another muscle fiber, but it's within the muscle. It stays within the muscle. It doesn't escape out into the blood flow. So when we take a blood measurement, we don't see an increase in lactate. But it doesn't mean that lactate's not being produced and eliminated. But it's staying within the musculature. When we see that appearance of lactate, when we start to see an increase in blood lactate, we say, they passed the first lactate turn point. What has happened? Well, now the rate of production in the muscle has exceeded that local ability to eliminate it. And we're starting to push lactate out. It's leaking into the extracellular fluid and into the capillaries, and it's appearing in the blood. Okay? But now when it goes into the blood, it is able to be sent to other organs. And as George Brooks has elegantly demonstrated, lactate is a wonderful molecule for moving energy around. It's not a poison. It's not a dead end metabolically, but it's a 2-carbon molecule we can move around in different cells and different organs. And the heart loves it. The liver can use it. The brain can use it, and so forth. So, but in that zone 2, production and elimination stay within tolerances. So elimination can match production. So lactate will stabilize again at a higher level. But when we exceed that third, or the lactate turn point number 2, then we get into this situation where all of us who have competed in very short events, we know what it feels like, the 6-minute rowing competition, the 3,000 meter in running, and so forth. It is a matter of seconds and minutes before we fail, not hours. The time shortens dramatically because now production exceeds elimination in the muscle, and production exceeds elimination in the systemic system. So it is a one-way trip towards failure. The only issue is how slowly, how quickly, or how can we delay that inevitability with training. And this is what the blood lactate responses will look like in those different zones. So that's the background for training zones. But what comes along with that blood lactate is a lot of stress responses, cortisol responses, adrenaline, heart rate variability, delays in recovery, and so forth, that have told us over the years now that one of the key issues here is the stress associated with these training zones. There's also some signaling issues, but a big issue for the day-to-day training organization of athletes is about how do we distribute the stress of the training, and having an idea about the intensity zones and the stress responses within those intensity zones has been proven to be very useful. Typical workouts in these zones. This is from a study we published years ago. You take well-trained athletes, 70 mLs per kg, doing all these different workouts, and this is what it looks like. And I remember speaking to them after they did either 1 hour or 2 hours at low intensity, and they said, "Oh, I feel better after the workout than I did when I started." And they're in heart rate variability, which is as an indication of parasympathetic stimulation, would often overshoot. They would have this surge above this almost parasympathetic overshoot after a 2-hour workout. That's how fit they were. That's how easily they tolerated the low intensity, which they do a lot of. But then as soon as you move into the threshold where lactate moves from 1 to 2.7, we saw a completely different response in terms of autonomic nervous system recovery. So that's helped guide us in understanding that yes, 3 zones, but actually, once we cross this frontier, some pretty significant things change in terms of how the body responds. And that's been important in understanding, we think, the way athletes actually choose to train. So if we go to economy, I'll just keep it short and say that what we see with efficiency or economy, efficiency is what you do when you can measure actual power. We call it economy in running because it's very difficult to measure the actual power output, but they're both trying to say the same thing. This is an example that you will be clear, or you will recognize the name, Paula Radcliffe. Up until very recently, she had the world record in the marathon. This is her, basically her career on one slide, thanks to Andy Jones. We've published this, now it's 17 years ago or so. Her VO2 max, once she probably hit about 19, it never really changed again. It didn't get higher. Very typical, we see this. VO2 max is the first to plateau in high performance athletes. Then her threshold continued to get better. Her speed at 2 millimolar lactate in this case. 25% change across several years. That's pretty useful if you're going to run a marathon. And then at the same time, her economy or her oxygen use at a given speed was going down. She was becoming more efficient. And that continued to happen for years. So what we see is different timelines on these adaptations. And if we try to put it on a timeline, this is kind of a generalized approximation of how training goes. At first, you improve rapidly, and then there's a law of diminishing return. We all know that. Any of us that have trained enough to feel that, yeah, at first everything works. But then if you want to get that last 5%, you seem to have to do more and more for less and less return. That's just life. That's how it works. But if we look at the adaptations, we could say that probably after a couple of years of specific training, past puberty, 18 to 20, say, or 17 to 19, we're going to see whatever VO2 max they're good for, pretty much, unless they train very wrong. You know, sometimes there are significant training errors, but for the most part, we're going to see a very early peak in VO2 max. And I've even had athletes that were 16, 17 years old with 85, 88 mLs per kg, but very light. I said, your VO2 max won't be this high in 2 years, but you'll be faster. And it was true. Then thresholds, and that peak is fairly close together because these adaptations are very synchronized and kind of there is that symorphosis, but thresholds do seem to peak a bit later. And then efficiency comes a bit later after that. Now, efficiency is the efficiency issue is probably very sport specific in terms of the scope for improvement and some of the issues associated with it, but it does seem to be an adaptation that can take longer to maximize. So it gives us hope for continuing to improve, particularly in longer events, perhaps. And then very recently, we've been struggling and trying to put our heads around what we seem to see, which is that over time, athletes, independent of these other adaptations, seem to, particularly in events like professional cycling, where the races are quite long, one of the keys to being a champion is that after 4 hours of racing, you're able to still produce very high peak power outputs, and that you have your fresh VO2 max and your fatigued VO2 max are very similar. Your fresh threshold power and your fatigued threshold power are very similar in the best of the best. They do not decay very much. And we've called that durability. And it's moved into the literature, and it seems to be an issue that we're trying to understand. What's different? What are those adaptations? I don't have the answers to that, but we see it when we know it when we see it. And it seems to be different from the other three. It's independent of or in addition to these other adaptations. So, point 2, Maslovian prioritization. And I would say it boils down to first things first, and staying healthy is priority 1. 2 years ago, about 5 or 6, I put this out on Twitter. I was just kind of perturbed, I think is the word, by the fact that it seemed like the things were turned upside down, that things that didn't matter very much were getting lots of attention, and the basic things were being ignored. And the basic things in endurance training, you got to train a lot. We haven't figured out a shortcut to that if you want to be exceptionally good in endurance. You need to train regularly. And you need to kind of mix up some high intensity and low. You need to get the intensity distribution reasonably correct for you. And if you do those things, a lot of good things happen. So that's the base. But under that is this. None of this happens if our athletes don't stay healthy. Now, I know health is a relative term. So I am clear on that. I'm careful with that and say mental and physical health. I want to just preface that and say, I understand the relativity of that construct. But within those issues, I would say staying healthy is a key to success for both the athletes, and keeping athletes healthy is a key to success for coaches. And we know this. We know if the foundation cracks, the cracks move upward. And it's consistently that when we talk with athletes who just won the world championship, the gold medal, and we ask them, what's the key? I stayed healthy. I didn't get hurt. I had a nice 6-month run of training with very little stoppage, very little break, no COVID, no injuries. Yeah, but what about the epic workouts? Epic workouts? No, that wasn't really what it was about. Now, I did 30 of a very tough workout. That was important, but there was no single workout that determined my success. Now, so, we with our methodologies that we impose on our athletes, we can either tend to kind of support their health, or we can tend to break it down. It's up to us as coaches. And we need to understand that, of course, they're coming to us and they're not in a vacuum. They are living their lives, and they have boyfriends and girlfriends, and they have parents, or they are parents, and they're stressed out, and they're dealing with COVID, or they're dealing with financial issues because, it's tough to be an athlete when you're not supported financially, and all of these things. And they all add up to various forms of stress, and all that stress goes in one bucket. And here's an example. This is a study on athletes in the United States. And they took a big group of athletes, they had them respond to two types of questionnaires, an undergraduate student questionnaire about stress, and then another stress called the psychological stress score. And they looked at their performance on that. Then they had them perform a very tough strength training session that was essentially designed to kick their butt and make them have to recover and get a lot of DOMS, delayed onset muscular soreness. They achieved that. But then what they saw was the rate of recovery, which is what you're seeing. Do I have a laser? But the lines, I don't think this is a laser, is it? No. Yeah, that's a good idea. So these athletes here scored poorly. They had more stress based on the undergraduate stress score, or more stress based on the psychological stress score, and they recovered more poorly. It took longer for them to recover their peak force. The athletes that said they were less stressed here and here had a completely different recovery curve. Now, we're kind of mixing brain and body here, folks, in an uncomfortable way that makes it tough for us to talk in these very specific patterns, periodization and the physical recovery, when something is different as just I've got semester exams can influence how I recover physiologically to a muscular stress. But it tells us something about the realities of stress and training, I think. And it is consistent with this kind of stress bucket model, which is to say that in an evolutionary perspective, we don't have separate stress types. We don't have our physical stress and our job stress and our relationship stress. We just have stress, which makes it pretty tough to distinguish for the body or for the brain. It doesn't in large scope. So the training reality that we end up facing with athletes is because they live a life, they're not in a vacuum, is stuff happens. Okay? I mean, athletes fall and get a concussion 3 weeks before the Olympic trials. I'm making up, this is a story I remember because it happened when I was working with speed skaters. These kind of things happen, and then they have to deal with it, right? All these plans go out the window the first time somebody hits you in the face. That's what a boxer once said, a famous boxer. So you have that reality, plus you have the problem of so-called butterfly effects, which is a little bit exaggerated, but the idea is that the butterfly flapping its wings down in South America, and it can end up causing a hurricane on the East Coast three weeks later. Well, I'm not sure about that, but the idea is relevant, and that is that small differences. We can see that the same athlete doing the same training program that gave them great results the year before doesn't give the same results the next year necessarily. And there's publications recently that showed exactly that. So there are differences magnified. And it makes coaching tough because the idea that I've got the recipe is probably suggests that you have too much hubris if you think you've got it not. And you know that what I did this year will work exactly perfectly next year. So what's the solution? Well, as best as I can tell, with all the physiology knowledge I know, the best solution is this: great communication between coach and athlete. It solves so many problems. Trust in each other, that the athlete trusts the coach, that they can be truthful and say, you know what? I'm tired. No, I can't say that. I might lose my seat in the boat, right? We are scared to reveal reality. But if there is a trusted relationship where the coach says, hey, I'm not out to get you. You're not weak if you're tired. We're in the long game here. So tell me where you're at, and then we can make corrections if we need to. So this is a key to success. Independent of all the hormone measurements and that heart rate variability, whatever, if you're not doing this, if you're not speaking honestly to each other, all is lost, I would say, or wasted. And then you do this. You eat, sleep, and revise. You iterate. You don't be afraid to deviate from the plan if the data says to, if the communication tells you to. You're saying, Stephen, I thought you were a physiologist. You sound like some health guru. But the reality is that this is physiology too. This is the reality of training. Third point, training intensity zones. I love them. I've spent a lot of time trying to measure them and so forth. And my 25 years on summary of them is what they really are is tools for balancing signal and stress. By signal, I mean the adaptive signal, that signal at the cellular level that is triggering a change in protein synthesis at its most fundamental level. But we have to balance those very cellular effects with systemic level stress responses and play the long game, to use a golf expression. And I hate golf. And I suck at it, that's why. So, you want to increase power or pace. When you train, you always train the brain, the heart, and the muscle. You can emphasize different aspects in your training, but if you're clicking along at 18 strokes a minute and rowing with a specific force signature, you're training your brain to repeat that motor pattern, whether it's the right one or the wrong one. You're training it. And untraining it can be quite difficult if it's wrong. So we should remember that all of these things are happening every workout to a greater or lesser degree. And so again, I'm trying to see, can I shift the fulcrum there so that I get a bit more stimulus with a little less stress? And it seems that conceptualization has some underpinnings and some explanatory value when it comes to how athletes actually train. Getting this right over time, making some decisions that shift it a little in their favor. Because stress happens, and there's a litany of different responses. I would argue there was principally systemic level problems, like autonomic nervous system dysfunction, like inflammation, and so forth, that we have to keep in check, because it will tend to happen. So the endurance training process, I guess, if you go away from that model where you say it's VO2 max times threshold times efficiency, you could think of that and look at it and say, well, that's a maximization problem. If I can just get more and more and more, then I go faster. But the reality is you can't, it doesn't work that way because you've got to deal with the reality of training as a stress, it's a stressor. So you have to optimize. You have to figure out the engineers love optimization problems. They're more fun, they're more tricky, but they're also very frustrating for coaches, right? So I'm kind of well known for this polarized training model and 80-20 and these kind of memes that have hit the, the internet for good and bad. And so if I try to reflect on how they have been interpreted and what I think is the reality, this is what I would say, that the most important thing that a distribution, intensity distribution like 80-20 or something like that, that's kind of has a lot of low stress workouts and some high stress, it seems to function as guardrails for the organism, for the athlete, keeping them moving forward. We're getting signal, we're getting adaptive responses, but we're keeping stress manageable. We're not eliminating. We don't want to. We're not eliminating some downstream strain effects, but we're mitigating, we're modifying, we're keeping it under control so that we get long-term progress and we don't miss training. So these guardrails seem to protect us from our own inertia. They protect us from our inexperience because we will tend to want to go harder. They will protect us from our ego. I think that's one of the biggest issues. Because I don't know about you, but if I'm cycling along and someone passes me, my first response is, what the heck are you doing? I'm on your tail. You think you can beat me just because I have gray hair? You bring out my inner beast, which is just dumb. Because I told myself that day I was going to go easy. I was going to do a 2-hour easy ride. And the first person that passes me, whoop, there went that plan. Right? So good athletes, what we see consistently is they put their ego at the door when they're training, especially on the low intensity sessions. They said, have fun, but come back tomorrow because tomorrow I'm doing a hill repeat session. Join me, right? So you have to let's just say, pick your battles and be disciplined and have intensity discipline. And then of course problems happen. And so they help us deal with these unforeseen problems. So it's a guardrail issue. Now, back some years, 2015 or so, I received a manuscript. I was asked to review it. It was from Stogel and Spearlick, and they were basically saying, hey, it seems like some people are calling polarized stuff that's not really polarized. It's not really lots of low, very little in the middle, and a bit of high. It's lots of low, more in the middle, and a little less high. There's a different kind of distribution. And I said, yeah, I think you're right. I think we are overusing it. It is getting misused. Go for this, push on it, So they published this review where they introduced the term a pyramidal intensity distribution back around 2015. And now these two terms have been put up against each other, these two methodologies. So what do we see? What we see is that what they share, pyramidal and polarized, is that most of the training is below that first lactate threshold. They're very similar in that regard, but what's different is the 20%, how it's distributed. And the polarized model says, well, very little threshold, but more in that zone 3. The pyramidal model says, no, it's more threshold and less in the zone 3. And the answer is, yep, they both work. And they seem to be dependent on where you are in your season, maybe what race you're preparing for. Are you a marathoner? Are you a rower? If you're a marathoner, then a threshold session is race pace. And it will be hard by a function of its duration. If you're a rower, you will probably be doing more of the zone 3 work because that's race pace. And it will be more challenging by a function of its intensity. But they're both very high stress sessions. They're very high stress workouts, and they have their place. And in the course of a season, you may see a progression from pyramidal towards polarized in the buildup. So I would just argue that this debate, this discussion is a moot point in many ways, because then if you're getting caught up in this, you don't understand training very well at the most fundamental levels of what's really happening. Plus, turns out that when you use heart rate and things like that, you get all kinds of it's almost impossible to have a polarized heart rate distribution because your heart rate moves through the threshold zone and you accumulate minutes on the way up and on the way down anyway. So it's tricky to measure. So when we say 20% of what, 80% of what, then I think this is instructive. Unfortunately, it wasn't me that made this little picture. It was a young guy. He has a YouTube channel. He's had me on his interview, but I found this on one of his recent videos and I liked it, so I stole it. And I told him I stole it. He was okay with that. But what he shows here is two hypothetical writers, one represented with his caricature head, which I guess means he would tend to do that, is you can have a 80-20 distribution of intensity and go out every day and do a mix of everything, right? And that's what he shows with writer one represented. And I guarantee you there's lots of cyclists that do that. Or that same, you could have writer two that has the same overall training intensity distribution, but they achieve it very differently by aggregating the high stress workouts, by introducing a rest day and so forth, by creating room for recovery and so forth. Both of these can show up exactly the same using your Polar watch or your Garmin time and zone. And so when I'm asked, what's polarized training? What do you mean? I'm saying I'm focusing on the sessions, not the minutes. Okay? So you can have a monotone stress load and it would still show up as 80-20 based on time and zone. That would be very wrong, I would say. That would be a really great recipe for stagnation. And it works if that's your goal, to create stagnation in your athlete. Whereas if we look at more what we've seen with elite athletes is they will instead say, you know what, when I have first decided to have a high stress workout, I can go ahead and have two that day. I can really push that day because I know I'm going to have recovery time after. That happens in high performance sport. We see that quite a bit. Jakob Ingebrigtsen, the gold medal 1500 meter, they would, after a race, they say, well, we really haven't trained this much. We've turned on the system, we've run a race, so now let's do an interval workout. So they would be training on the track after the race to get in a better signal, to make sure they've used that day. So that's a different way of thinking, concentrating the loading. So yeah, I've turned on the stress recovery clock. I might as well turn it on well and line everything up so that I have that synchronized time to recover. So when you put all that together, you could essentially argue that training intensity zones can almost be seen as two, a low stress zone and a high stress zone. And we're kind of managing that balance based on some individualization issues, some particular sports specificity issues, and some generalizable issues. And we also are aware that that line can change, that distinguishing line between low and high stress can shift in the workout because of fatigue, particularly long sessions, for example. So these test results from a rested state should not be seen as in stone. They're not static. They shift, they change, and multiple studies have demonstrated this over multiple distances. Efficiency goes down during the workout, for example. So we have to take this into account when, being careful that, yeah, that 3-4 hour cycling ride that started low stress for me ended up pretty high stress because I went empty glycogen. I started recruiting lots of fast twitch fibers. I started releasing a bunch of cortisol, and it ended up being a high stress session because I went too far. So I would argue that when we're trying to make this accounting, that we think of these buckets, and we're putting workouts in buckets, a low stress bucket and a high stress bucket. And really, we could just have an orange bucket, but I've made 3 buckets here. Now, the risk will almost always be when we work with athletes that they will do this. This is the regression that we often see, particularly in old codgers like me, that we don't train that much. We're not that fit. We want to have fun. And we don't have very good discipline. And so we make low intensity sessions, they get too hard, and then we're too fatigued to really do quality high intensity sessions. So that's the most likely outcome if we're dumb. And that's what I fight against all the time, is that regression towards that middle intensity zone. But what I see is that really successful endurance athletes, they have that intensity discipline, and this doesn't happen very often. And they avoid that training intensity black hole that leads to a monotone load and a lot of stagnation and a risk of overreaching and so forth. Point 4, triangulation helps us know where we are in training. 25 years has told me that, look, you can get enamored by various methodologies of measurement, the newest thing in heart rate variability or muscle oxygenation or whatever. I have not found any single measurement that can really serve alone as a tool for monitoring all by itself. And so I would argue to you that we do need to triangulate in some ways, not necessarily every day having all three of these measurements, but if we're going to really get at this, which is what happens in workouts, this is that daily relationship between the work we did and how we responded. What did it cost? And that cost is variable. It changes from day to day because of different issues, stress, injury, and so forth. Training, appropriate adaptations, maladaptations, and so forth. And to get at that, we need this kind of checks and balances system over time. That would be my summation after 25 years of trying to do this. And we got to keep the brain in the game. And again, that comes down to that good communication. We have to ask athletes how they feel. And it turns out that this side is the canary in the coal mine. It still works. It's still the first thing that shows up. You know, despite all of our efforts to do all kinds of fancy physiology, this is what ends up showing up first as an indicator that something's awry. So we should trust that. The brain is a pretty good tool. Don't misuse it or don't forget to use it. And one of the downstream effects of digitization, it's great that I can speak now to a crowd. Some people are all over the country listening on Zoom, but the downside of some of that technology is that it is really easy to create training metrics. It should not be this easy because it results in a lot of stuff that's just not validated. It's just not necessarily measuring what it's supposed to be measured, and it confuses the heck out of people. So I've tried to get through this. It's still a work in progress, but engineers use these three, and I can push you to my YouTube video on this, and we'll talk about it more another time. But it seems like this is a reasonable set of metrics where the load is just neutral. It's just what we do. We can calibrate it against a threshold power or something, but it should not be seen as a stressor. It's not stress. It's the work that we do, how we respond to that work. That's stress, and that happens during workouts. And it's variable. It depends on the nature of the workout, the nature of the load, but also our training state. And maybe we're about to come down with a cold, or maybe we're stressed out because of a relationship. So the stress response we can get at with some different variables that I point out here, like heart rate, like perceived exertion, like ventilation, turns out. I'm going to show you that in a minute. And then stress is an acute situation, but if we're getting the stress response wrong, if we're overloading the athlete over consecutive days, then often what we will see is some kind of a strain response. This is an accumulated kind of side effect. The body gets, the structures get deformed, as the engineers would say, for a period. Heart rate responses are wrong. They're too high or too low. Heart rate variability shifts. Peak blood lactate goes down. Max heart rate. They say, I can't get my heart rate up. We've all heard these things. We've experienced many of them. These are these strain responses. And I would say, if we're seeing them 24 hours post, more than 24 hours post, then this is something we're looking at. Within 24 hours, I would call it just part of the normal fatigue response that we're recovering from. But if it's lingering 2 days later, well, we need to look at it. We seem to have pushed a bit hard. How far do we want to push this athlete? Their heart rate responses are really changing. Tour de France, 21 days on the bike, 20 days on the bike. you know, with a couple of recovery days where they still ride, maximum heart rate will drop 20 beats on some of those athletes in the course of that 3 weeks. They have big time parasympathetic hyperactivity. So there's a big strain on their bodies, particularly the domestics, the ones that are just having to help. The riders that suffer sometimes the least are the ones that are protecting, that we're going to do the climbs up and win the race and get all the glory. So bottom line, all the metrics, these still are these fundamental questions we want to answer. So that doesn't really change, and it needs to stay simple. And we shouldn't be overwhelmed by numbers. We can use perceptual measures. Now, I think this is a tool that we need to understand. This is Borg scale. Here's a study we did with 63 athletes. In culmination, they did over 500 workouts that were either 4 times 4 minutes, 4 times 8 minutes, or 4 times 6 minutes, 16 minutes, excuse me, in different points in a periodization plan. Everything was balanced. We got a lot of data on how they responded to a very basic recipe. We said, here is what you're going to do. 4 times 8 minutes with 2 minutes recovery. Your goal is to maintain the highest average power you can. So we've given them an equation, and then we say, solve the equation with your power output. Does that make sense? We called it maximum session effort. And so then we measured, given that recipe and given the prescription, 4 times 4 minutes, 4 times 8 minutes, or 4 times 16 minutes, how did they respond? Heart rate, perceived exertion, lactate, and so forth. And what you see here are the different workouts. On this top, you see power. And what you see is very typical for athletes is when you give them the prescription, they zero in on the appropriate power quite quickly. So it wasn't varying very much on average. They find their power and they hold it. But that wasn't always the case, and I'll come back to that. Heart rate peak, this is what you typically see. You see a drift upward, but the starting point is lower for the longer workouts. Makes sense. But then it's a linear increase. It's very similar for all three. And then you look at perceived exertion. So this is the 4 times 4, this is 4 times 8, and this is 4 times 16. What you see? Well, predictably, it's harder that first interval, but then the rate of change is the same across these different sessions. So they're very predictable outcomes when you first give these prescriptions. And then you can kind of use that to say, well, what do I want my athlete to do today? Well, I want you to do this workout. You're probably going to start at about 15. You'll end up at a 17 or 18. If they start at a 12, that's too easy. If they start at a 17, they're probably going to fail the workout, meaning they're not going to be able to maintain power. So it's a pretty predictable approach if you use perceived exertion. And when you look at the relationship between perceived exertion and heart rate over a very narrow range, 86 to 98%, it's quite linear in the big scale, in averaged responses. But what you see is that when we prescribe these workouts, this says increasing power, meaning they tended to actually have negative splits. They were able to perform better at the end. This is they stayed even. This is they kind of failed. Their power went down at the end. What we see is this failure almost never happens in the 4.8, 4.16, but the 4 times 4 minute is very frequently misjudged. It's a tough workout because there's that anaerobic component. They go out too hard, and if they go out too hard, they pay big time, right? So we see a difference in how the athletes tend to respond to these. So what we concluded, because remember, we told these athletes maximum session effort. And we might have expected, given that they would all end up at the same perceived exertion, the same RPE score at the end, right? Does that make sense that might have happened with that prescription? They all ended up at an 18 on average, but they didn't. 4 times 16 minutes, they're pushing hard, and we had them in a group environment. They're highly motivated. They're working hard, but their peak RPE at the end of a 16-minute effort is, where are we at? Somewhere around 16 and a half, 17. There's still scope there. Are they not working hard? Are they soft? We don't think so. We think what's going on is the brain is kind of integrating two things, and we can kind of distinguish the very acute exertion. How do I feel exactly now, pushing 500 watts on the rowing machine at the end of a 6-minute test versus the effort, which is stretched over time. And so it seems the data was highly consistent with us saying effort, that the brain's ability to concentrate and perform at a given workload over a given time, that area under the curve, we might call that the effort. That is it's proportional to the exertion times the time. Does that make sense? So you can be at a RP of 19 for 2-3 minutes, or you can be at an RP of 16 for 100 minutes. And it seems like that athletes choose the latter in their training process more than the former. They choose to accumulate more minutes at somewhat reduced acute exertion. And that seems to be an effective way to mitigate and manage stress. Now, one of the things, do I have time? So now you're really curious. So our typical tool, the tool we've had for several decades, many decades now, is heart rate monitoring. It gives us a window into the intensity, that internal load. But when we take people into the laboratory, we've always measured both heart rate and gas exchange. We've measured their breathing because we've needed to collect gas to measure oxygen consumption, to measure their VO2 max and so forth. But the ventilation, breathing, has been a laboratory variable. And we kind of know, we know through a lot of physiology that for the most part, the lungs are not the limiting factor. So we've kind of neglected them and said, we just need a cardiovascular person. We don't need a pulmonary person to deal with this stuff. But I think we're going back and looking at that again to some extent. And new technologies are appearing. I work with a company that makes this one. This is it's kind of cute. Now it's a vest. It started out as a shirt, but now it's a vest. So my belly button shows when I'm working out up in my cycling room. But it has a very sophisticated stretch sensor that is measuring breathing frequency and excursion and calibrated. And it's also an inertial measurement unit, and it's capturing cadence and various things. And it's going to a smartphone and then a cloud. So I'm getting ventilation. And we're using this with running, with cycling. We're testing it with different sports. And we now have a professional cycling team where every athlete will have one of these, and we'll be collecting a lot of data. So one of the things that we see so far, this is from I'm going to say athlete, but it's me, so I feel a little bit embarrassed to use that term. But it's me cycling. I did this for you a couple of days ago before I left Norway, a 5 times 10-minute workout, which is kind of upper threshold, right around that second lactate threshold for me, 310 watts or so, 8. And what you see, the red line is heart rate, and the black line is breathing frequency. Here. What do you see? Power is the same within a water tube, 2-3 watts across the 5 times 10 workout. So I managed to, the session goal approach, I managed to hold power pretty constant. By the end, my heart rate's pretty high. But what we see consistently is the scope for ventilatory change is much bigger than the scope for heart rate. And heart rate may be saying, what's wrong with you, Silo? You're at only 91% of max. You got more to give. But breathing is saying something else because I'm pushing really high ventilatory frequency. I have almost, if I combine heart rate and ventilation, I've doubled that multiplier, that stress. So we're looking at using ventilation to help us do a better job of quantifying how deep is this athlete going in addition to heart rate, because heart rate doesn't tell the whole story at high intensity because of ceiling effects. Here's another workout that exemplifies this. This is one of these typical micro interval workouts that are very popular in cycling and running, 30-30s, 30-15s, and so forth. You don't do it so much in rowing, I don't think. But here you see the red line is heart rate again. You get this quasi-steady state, very typical response, about 92% of heart rate max. But look at what ventilation is doing. Ventilation is climbing, climbing, climbing. And that is very consistent with the actual feeling, which is this is getting harder and harder and harder. It's not stable. I'm not in a steady state. Give me a break. You know, I almost want heart rate to go up so that it will tell the truth of how I actually feel. But breathing seems to do that. So this is just, we're trying to get at this. We'll see. We're measuring a lot of people right now. We're doing a lot of data collection, both on regular performers and also elite athletes. So it'll be interesting. And then finally, I want to say, you know, going through this process of studying sports and training, I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of different groups: skiers, rowers, runners, cyclists, speed skaters, kayak athletes, and so forth, orienteers. And so in my initial foray into this, I expected much bigger specificity issues sport to sport. But what I ended up seeing is a great deal of universality, and then some specificity issues, some very sport specific issues. The universals I've discussed, but there are a few. The universals to me, if we're working with athletes, even today I spoke to a course and I said, if we were taking a person that sat on the sofa and we're going to, for the first time, they're going to train for 12 weeks and run their first 10K, this is what I would tell them to do. And it's not very different than what we would say when it comes to the development of athletes. The first thing I would think about is frequency. I got to move that up. We're going to agree on a frequency. If it's an elite athlete, they're slowly going to progress how much they train, how often they train. But that's the first thing we're going to do, is we're going to establish the frequency, and we're going to deal with it and be able to handle it. And it's a habit, and it's healthy for them. It's sustainable. Then we're going to increase duration. We're going to lengthen workouts. And this is what's consistent with what we see in the progression of athletes. And then we're going to add intensity. And I say that with that emphasis because very often we flip this. We flip this pyramid around. And the first thing the person does is try to solve the problem with more intensity. And this is a very different, what we see in the most successful athletes is they get this right and they use intensity carefully, correctly, aggressively when they use it, but not sporadically, not spuriously. They mostly rely on consistency, high frequency of training, doubles. We see it, we're training twice a day. Seems to be a useful way to go. But you have to be able to get there. You have to adapt to a level where you're ready for that. And the workouts get longer. And we haven't seen shortcuts around that. This is just one example to conclude. World champion 21, junior world champion. We have good data on his performance because it's a Norwegian kid that is coached by a guy I work with a lot. So here we see, what did he do from age 14 to 18? Total training hours at age, let's see if I can get this. Where am I? There we are. Age 14, he's trained about 300 hours. 15, he's made a big jump here. That would normally not happen, but he did. 600 hours, 700, 850, 950. 18 years old. Average session duration, 60 minutes, 81, 87, 100, 120. Number of sessions peaks out during the pandemic, 559 sessions, 17. What about intensity? Well, cyclists love to use a lot of zones, but what you basically see is these green and blue are below the first LT, first lactate turn point. 90% of his training is there. Some threshold work. You can argue whether this is threshold or whether it should be up in zone 3, but you could call this a pyramidal distribution. But what you basically see is it's not intensity that's changing. That distribution is very similar. But he's doing just more and more and tolerating it and becomes a world champion. Now he's on a protein. And what does power duration do? This is that standard curve. Does it move up in very specific ways? No, the whole curve moves up over time. And his curve will have to stretch out over hours if he's going to be a world tour level cyclist, because the real fun happens after 4 hours at that level, or 5. So there are some sport specificity issues. It seems that because of mechanical loading, because of ballistic stress, that elite performers in different sports disciplines can be doing pretty different annual hour counts. But it doesn't mean the runners are wimps and the swimmers are amazing. It means the swimmers have 0 eccentric loading. The runners have a lot. So there's differences in mechanical stress, and it has to be accounted for. But surprisingly, the training intensity distributions are quite similar. And Trent Stellingworth shows this. He takes us through a little calculation. I don't think you can see it super well, but he just measures. He says, well, the rower, he's at 50 to 120 strokes per kilometer, 10,000 to 15,000 strokes per week. The time under tension is about 900 milliseconds per stroke. So he goes through this math to come through to some kind of a load in kilograms. And it's 900,000 to 1.3 million kilograms per week. Then he looks at the runner, smaller, but he's at about 190 steps per minute. His time under tension is 150 milliseconds instead of 900 milliseconds. The weight per step, it comes out to 28 to 35 million kilograms per week if you do the accounting this way. And he's just arguing, he's saying, hey, is this why the runner can do 25 to 30 hours in peak weeks? The runner is at 10 to 12. And they're both world class. So there is some sports, there are specificity issues that we do need to be aware of when we're having these conversations across sport. That's when things get tricky. And finally, John Kiley, he's not here, but he's he's worked with a lot of sports in the UK. He's published some nice papers, kind of challenging our understanding of periodization. Everybody's heard the term periodization. It's a misused term. It's very popular. And he's saying, look, the history of periodization is not always what you think. There's a lot less evidence to support these different models than maybe you think, because you can be very convincing in your marketing of different models. But in reality, there are so many different issues at an individual level, the genetic aspects, predisposition and state traits, stress history, prior training, current stress, that serve as filters for whatever that training program you're doing, where the outcome can be quite different at the individual level. And he tries to remind us, and I think that if you go to Kiley 2018 or 2012, 2019, he's got several papers. I would strongly recommend having a read through them and thinking through what you think you understand about periodization and where you think you got it from. It's quite an interesting history. And the evidence for a very clear effect of very specific periodization models is actually quite weak. But when we do the basic things well, then a lot of good things happen. So with that, I'll say questions, or I'm ready for questions, maybe.
So I'm going to try to get the microphone round to people so people at home can hear, but first one.
Now, my question is specifically, how far do you think, and this is a big strategic question, how far do you think polarized training can be applied to the older athlete?
Well, I think at least the directionality of what you're asking suggests a point which is unfortunate, and that is if you take the concept polarized training to its like evil extension, you would be on the sofa or you would be sprinting, right? Well, and that's really not what we're saying. And I actually would never say to a 60-year-old, you really need to be doing a lot of 30-second sprints. I'm going to be honest with you. Now, I do some of those myself, but it's just because I'm dumb and I compete, but I don't see it as a health issue. However, the 80% aspect of polarized training, saying to people like me who are getting older, hey, most of the time, I want you to be enjoying this, staying in the green zone, talking, and this has remarkable benefits for you. You don't need to be suffering every time you go out on the bike. I think that's an important message. The other message I would include to any 60-plus athlete or even 40, 55, 50-plus athlete is get in the strength room. Twice a week. Get in the strength room, because as an older person, we're losing muscle mass. And that's probably more important from a health perspective than me being able to do a 30-second sprint. I need to maintain enough muscle mass to do activities of daily living, to push up the steps and so forth. So if I'm pushing a health agenda, I would say mostly do a lot of strength training as much as you can and do the moderate green zone stuff. And you're going to have a pretty good recipe for a healthy aging. And you don't need to do the intervals if you don't want to. Yeah.
Steve, Andrew Randall, British Rowing. Thanks very much for your presentation. Loved it. I'm working with the women at the centre at the moment. So my question to you is, I know you coach your daughter regularly. Do you approach the training model differently, the different sexes, males and females?
Right. Great question. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. We've just done a big study where we've been interviewing champion coaches of champions in Norway and across sports. And we've asked that question to every coach as part of some generalized questions. And the basic answer is no. That women, I mean, let's just put it this way, the similarities in how they should train are much bigger than any systematic differences where we should say train women like this, train men like this, train women less, train men more. We don't see that. We've had highly successful female athletes that train just as much as the men. Now, there is a caveat to that. In a sport like rowing or a sport like running, where we measure volume often in kilometers, if their speed their cruising speed is lower, then maybe we need to take that into account. So the hour counts may be a bit different, or we may have to compensate. So it depends on how you do your accounting, I guess I would say. And the body doesn't count kilometers. It maybe is sensitive to duration at some level. And we haven't seen evidence to say women should be training less than men or anything like that. Now, there is the issue of menstruation. There is the issue of individual differences in hormone status and how that may impact their ability to handle certain kinds of training. But I think that's more of an individual issue than it is a generalizable men versus women issue, if that makes sense. But there has to be, here's the scary thing, especially if it's a male coach, female athletes, is there's this communication issue. Is that there's got to be enough trust that the athlete can say, hey, right now, that hard interval session is probably not ideal for me today. Can I have 2 days? And I'll do it because of where I'm at in my cycle. Okay. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Hi, regarding the slide with the guy who did, mixed intensity on every day of the week, and then the model that you preferred below, would you advise doing, so say you're doing a zone 2 ride, would you advise sticking in zone 2 entirely? And does it spoil your workout if you go into the other zones?
The only thing I would say on that, it's a bit of a slippery slope, because it is tempting sometimes, and I've done it myself, that we argue and say, well, if we just do like 6-second sprints during those easy rides, we can do some of those and we can get some neuromuscular training. We do that in running training as well, that we'll have long, easy runs, but we'll throw in some strides that, for just a few seconds. And we'll say 6 to 8, because then we kind of avoid much of a lactate effect, a lactate increase. So I think you can spice up a green zone workout periodically, but I would just caution that there will tend to be that you'll tend to just keep adding more and more. And pretty soon you're right back where you started with this mixed bag. So be careful of how much you do that. I can give you an anecdotal example. Olaf Tufte, who won a couple of gold medals in the single in 2004 and 2008. At one point, he was testing out a new boat, a new single, and he started just during the easy workouts, he started just cranking it a bit to kind of test the boat, get the feel. And he was doing this pretty frequently, and pretty soon he was getting tired. And the coach had to say, wait, shut that down, you know. And so it doesn't take a whole lot when you're at the ragged edge to push you over, right? So you got to be careful, be disciplined.
Anyone else like to ask?
Thank you very much, Steve. That was fantastic. And I'm sorry I was late and interrupted you.
I didn't see you come in later. I would have said push-ups for you.
Excellent.
I
Still can't do more than two. Too much of Cox. So I'm interested in your new vest and your heart rate versus breathing rate.
Yeah.
Have you connected that at all to any difference in lactic acid or oxygen processing in the body, or are you not at that stage yet? Because it was interesting to see that change towards the end.
Right. No, I mean, those were, you know, I was measuring, this is happening simultaneously. So it's just, in that situation, it's just showing that the scope for ventilation seems to be bigger. And also there's been some really good work by a group in Rome, and just wrote a beautiful review on, it seems that the brain regulates tidal volume and breathing frequency in different parts of the brain with a different mix of signaling. And so the frequency part is pretty straightforward to measure. And it seems to be a pretty nice indicator of just, you might say, mobilization. How deeply is this athlete having to mobilize at this moment to achieve that power output? And so that's what we're seeing it as a tool. Now we're going to be measuring a lot of other things, and we'll be getting at some of your questions, but it's early days.
And if you don't mind, connected with that same area, I'm very interested in that because, of course, especially at the very novice stage, people talk about, you know, where you breathe on a stroke for rowers,
right?
Which perhaps doesn't happen in quite a lot of other sports. Would do for swimming, though, of course.
Right, in training.
Yeah. So do you think that might have a bit of an impact on what could be achieved by examining ventilation?
Exactly. I think you're spot on. Is we need to, one thing, the different movements. Cycling doesn't have much in the way of entrainment. It's not problematic. Running does probably have some entrainment. Rowing has a ton. It's almost impossible not to align breathing with the different key moments in the stroke. So what we got to look at is whether the vest is able to distinguish some artifact that's a function of, for example, the muscular contraction of the catch from breathing. And so the filtering issues there's some technical issues that we've got to look at to see, can we capture that appropriately? But we'll get there. I mean, not me, engineers will get there. I'll just tell them when they get there.
Anybody else? Thank you. I'm going to ask real quick, Steve. We know lots about heart rate max, and you talk a lot about inability to accurately predict heart rate max from formulas.
Yeah.
But what about breathing frequency? How similar is that in spreads of athletes?
Well, I've got several projects going on in the lab right now. I was answering a question for one of my students, and that's one of the things we're trying to see is what's the scope, what's the variation in maximum breathing frequency. What I do know from myself, having done a lot of testing on myself, because I don't have a life and I do have a cycling room, is that I'm pretty consistent in that around 77 breaths per minute is about what I would say is my maximum functional breathing frequency during cycling. And it seems to be pretty darn reproducible. So I think we're going to be able to use a kind of a Carvonen type approach where we have a maximum breathing frequency and a resting, and we look at that spread just like we do with heart rate reserve. That's where I'm thinking we're going to go.
Hi, you just answered a question about whether sex should affect the proportion of time in training zones.
Yeah.
And I was also wondering whether age, so say teenagers compared to 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, would have any effect of the amount of time or proportion of time you should spend per training zone.
Yeah, great question. I think at a very early age, if we're talking really young, and their volumes, what you end up with a problem with the weekly calendar, Because if you say, well, I want you to do 80-20, so 8 out of 10 workouts is low intensity. Well, you have a 7-day week, so it's kind of hard to get those things to align. And so I suspect at a young age, when they're only training 3 or 4 times a week and they've got rest days, then probably that distribution will look more maybe 60-40 or something like that. You with me? But as they start to increase the frequency of training, then we're going to see it move towards that distribution that I showed you, if that makes sense to you. If you're training 3 days a week, let's face it, you can pretty much do what you want. And you're going to be able to recover because you've got all these other days if you use them appropriately. If that's the all you can train 3 days a week, I've said probably you just go for it. I would maybe do 2 hard and 2 easy long and 1 easy, excuse me, 2 low intensity and 1 interval session if I could only train 3 days a week. Something like that. When that would not be 80-20. With me? Yeah.
Well, that just leaves me with 2 things to do. One, to say thank you to you for all coming tonight and asking great questions, for people joining in on the webinar. Good to see everybody. Really an interesting range of athletes and coaches and people in the room. So great to see the kind of people Steve brings out. And of course, from all of us, Steve, thank you very much for giving up those nice views for a few days and coming over to Oxfordshire and giving us your intelligence and your experience.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Great fun.